So I think we all know the story about the BC epidemic and how it spread across the Rocky Mountains into new habitat where it has new interactions with different species as well as a new climate. You know this is a federal map because it's got Ontario on it, and these are the those little eastern satellite infestations I was mentioning, Alan, that in 2012 that showed up they're quite interesting. Anyway, so when I first started in 2010, China come up with a research project that addressed the threat assessment for the boreal forest, which was the parameters for CFS at the time. For our research, I heard reports from northern Alberta about this crazy stuff that was going on there in terms of the life cycle. So apparently there was multiple cohorts, there was pupa in the fall, there was these really complex life cycles going on up there, and so I thought this might be an interesting thing to look at. And we know, and we've known for a long time, that there's a lot of variation in mountain pine beetle development. This is from De Leon, from work he did in the 30s. He's doing his work in northern Idaho, and certainly Dr. Rob Reed, who did his work in the 50s and 60s in southern BC, has stuff that supports this. And we're most familiar with, he had 3 groups of attacked trees, and we're most familiar with group 3, where you have the beetles attacking in mid-July through mid-August. They get to late-in star larvae before winter. They overwinter as late-in star larvae, the most cold-hardy stage, finish development in the spring and fly. But De Leon was kind of obsessed with explaining why populations grew at a rate faster than predicted, especially in areas where they had just done control work. And he was all about these parent females emerging and reattacking in the same year to establish a second brood. So what would happen is she'd attack this tree mid-July, a few weeks later she'd emerge, attack a new tree late August. Now that brood, her second brood's only going to get to small instar larvae by the time winter rolls around. They overwinter as that, finish development the next year. Of course they need longer to finish their development, so they're not going to emerge again until late in the season, and then they attack those trees. There's also the scenario where those beetles attacking the trees late in the year are actually going to overwinter themselves, those parent moms, and then what's going to happen in the spring, they're ready to go, and they're going to lay eggs early in the year, and so their brood is going to roll through to the young adult stage and overwinter as that stage, and in the following year emerge to attack trees in the spring. So the point of this is not about the 2 broods per female necessarily. It's really about the variation that you can get in the life cycle, and this is all within 1 year. So we haven't even talked yet about what happens if your summers are cooler like in the north and you get 1+ year development or a 2-year type of cycle. So Alan mentioned I'd been out with Rob Bleiker to the Yukon. Now Rob was nicer than Mike Gravel from the Northwest Territories because he took me out in June instead of March when it was -30. And we did see a lot of complex stuff there where the temperatures were cooler. We saw no survival above the snow line. Snow line was was only about 30 centimeters when the cold weather hit up there, which was like a year ago, January. When it got down to -40, everything was dead. But I did see crazy stuff going on in that bottom 30 centimeters where there was survival. So anyways, the main thing you need to know about the biology of mountain pine beetle for this talk, because I'm going to talk about research we've done the last couple of years, where FRI was a major funding partner for that work, is that mountain pine beetle doesn't have an obligate diapause. So most insects in temperate climates have a diapause to help them synchronize themselves and as well as with the environment to get through harsh times. So spruce beetle has an obligate diapause as an adult, has a facultative one as a larva, or actually a prepupa in the 2-year cycle. Mountain pine beetle doesn't have that. Development is totally temperature driven. So we asked the question how mountain pine beetle phenology development will interact with the climate and the new habitat and affect its population success. So we want to do a fine resolution study of development and temperature, sort of at the tree level and even within the tree level. And then, since we had the bark off the trees anyways, we thought we'd look at some productivity measures and attack characteristics. And one of the goals of the work is to actually parameterize some of the population models that already exist for mountain pine beetle. There's a phenology model, so hopefully some of the data generated in this work can go into improving that model. It's developed for the US, so it can be parameterized for northern Alberta. And then the work we're hoping to do next is around cold tolerance and winter survival. And that we hope will eventually help parameterize the survival model. I'm not going to talk any more about that because there's other people like Barry that can talk about the modeling work more competently than me, because that's not my shtick. So we did this work in 3 geographic regions. Basically, we didn't have anything here because, like Alan said, you can't buy a mountain pine beetle in this area. So unfortunately, we weren't able to have research sites in the heart of BC. So we had some down here in southern BC around Princeton. And there's 2 sites at about 1,400 meters and 1 site that's 1,700 meters. And the old timers will tell you that 1,700 meters is about that. That's the elevation in southern BC where you start to see life cycles greater than 1 year. Okay, so it's an interesting site, and I try and graph it a lot separately, the high elevation site, Princeton. We also have some sites up here in Smithers, always been mountain pine beetle in Smithers, on and off, sometimes 2-year cycle because it can have a really cool summer. Sometimes it's great for it. And then over in Terrace, and Terrace is really close to Smithers, but it's on the other side of the mountains, has a much milder, more Pacific influence on the climate. Although the pine there, I don't think is great for mountain pine beetle because it's growing on really poor quality sites with hemlock. And then east of the divide, we had some sites in Fort St. John that we only had them for 1 year because the beetle blew up so bad that there was nothing left. To tie that into Barry's question, I do think those beetles came out. I think they didn't even look. I think they moved on. They're probably the ones that went further north to Fort Nelson, I don't know. But we had tons of beetles generated and hardly any in our traps in the site, which to me means they didn't stay and look. They just left. But I'm digressing. So then we had some sites in Grande Prairie. We had one right outside Grande Prairie, and Grande Prairie is kind of a hot spot in the summer and a cold spot in the winter, it seems like, from the weather data. So that site's a little bit different than the other 3 Grande Prairie sites, which are a little bit further south, sorry, and a couple over in Fox Creek. All right, so this just shows our sites by latitude along the x-axis, and then the actual elevation of the sites in black. And then the gray bar is just an adjustment we made for latitude. So what would be the elevation of all these sites if they were actually at the same latitude? And that's just adding 120 meters for every 1 degree north, according to Hopkins' bioclimatic rule. And you can see they all fall sort of within that 1,400, 1,600 meter thing, except for the weird terrace sites, of course. This is a high elevation Princeton site, obviously. But all these guys east of the divide are kind of similar to our Princeton sites. So for the 2 years that we were doing sampling in the trees, this just shows the flight times. We were out there enough that we were able to try and pinpoint when the trees were attacked, get them wired with temperature probes, and start sampling the development of insects over the 1 year life cycle. And I think this is old news from people from Alberta, but at the time we thought they might fly later, of course, being further north, but in fact they tend to fly earlier in Alberta. By probably 3 weeks compared to the sites in British Columbia. So they're flying there in mid-July. 2011 was a cool spring and summer for both BC and Alberta, and they flew a few weeks late in both places. We're not continuing on with this work exactly, so I don't know when the flight time was in 2012, but if some of the FHOs know and could fill me in on that, I'd really like to know. So we looked at our degree day accumulation. This is by month. We should have it by day, but this is what we have right now. And terrace is the green line, so let's just ignore it because, as I mentioned, it's a bit of an oddball, what are going on in there and why the beetle doesn't do well, which is probably more related to the poor quality of the trees. But the dashed red and orange lines are your sites east of the divide. And what you can see compared to the black line, which is the low elevation Princeton sites, or the 1,400 meter Princeton sites, is it warms up earlier in the spring, and they're actually getting more degree days there. And 2011 was the cool year, so pattern held for spring 2012 as well. I don't care so much about this. I really care about the thermal units that these developing insects got for the generation. So that includes just a chunk of the season, the growing season, pre-winter and then post-winter of a different year, right? So if the trees were attacked mid-July, what kind of thermal units did they receive before entering the winter? And so this is going to vary by region depending on when the flight is. Okay, so these maps show what this happens to be for trees attacked in 2011. We have it 2010. Sorry, we have it for 2011 as well. Same pattern, although the totals vary. But basically, these trees have a lot of heat units accumulated pre-winter because they're attacked earlier, and also probably yeah. Okay, I'll leave it there. And so here's the 1,400 meter Princeton sites. So what's interesting here is the proportional difference, total degree days pre and post winter to me, and then also you can see the total degree days, 936 here, 1,273 here. So lots of degree days in Alberta. It's 833 with this base temperature for a one year cycle. You know, and that's pretty good because actually here at the high elevation Princeton, where we only got 657, Smithers, where we only got 816 total, we did see them flip into a 1+ year cycle. They couldn't quite get through in 1 year. So pretty good estimate from the literature. So we wanted to know if this was sort of normal for the different regions. So I have co-op student Paige Barrett, who has been fooling around with biosim for another purpose, but she ran this graph which shows the cumulative degree days for our sites projected by biosim using weather from data nearby weather stations from 1980 through 2010. And again, you can see here's Princeton 1,400 meters, so you can see the sites east of the divide are doing quite well in terms of degree days. This is the site that's close to Grande Prairie town. These are the other Grande Prairie sites. This is interesting when you think about the adjusted elevation, had these all kind of at a similar elevation. Yeah, sorry, I'm going to come back to a point on that in terms of adaptive seasonality. So I don't have our temperature data and our insect data reconciled yet together. So I'm just going to show you the development data for the insects summarized by region, but we eventually hope to get this, well, we will get it reconciled at the tree level on a much finer scale. But what you have here is for the 2 years of attacked trees, you have the life stages, eggs in blue, early instar larvae in pink, and late instar larvae in green, entering the winter. So here, terrace trees attacked in 2010. Most of them entered the winter in late instar larvae. 2011, that was our cool spring summer, so had a high proportion, half and half of early and late instar larvae. Down here in Princeton, most of them go through as early instar larvae, it seems, into the winter. And same with Smithers, most early instar larvae. Worse this year, obviously, the cool year. Fort St. John, like I said, the sites blew up, there's nothing left, so we only have 1 year, and they were all late instar larvae, like clockwork. So over in Grande Prairie, first year did very well. Second year, there was a lot more in an earlier instar larva stage, just because of that late flight. But still, you had a good proportion of the population that were late instar larvae. Now, although we're not doing exactly this work anymore, we are out there now trying to look at winter survival and cold tolerance. I don't know when the trees were attacked this year, but in 2012. But we do know the stages that entered the winter. That is, I don't know when the flight was, but we do know the stages that entered the winter. We had to move from Princeton because a couple of our populations petered out. We still have our high elevation sites, but our low elevation sites kind of petered out. And so we're in Kelowna here. But we had a high proportion of eggs, which was quite surprising to me, and early instar larvae, and then about a quarter, or just under a quarter, is late instar larvae. What was interesting here was up in Alberta, we had a high proportion of late instar larvae, but we had this little wedge of new adults that's actually tenor adults. So they actually developed a little bit too far. They actually managed to pupate. And this was mainly at that one site that was very close to the town of Grande Prairie. And I know this has happened in 2009, all along Resources Road there and by Weyerhaeuser. I think they all entered as 10-year-old adults, died, but a little bit out of town. They do just fine. And you're going to harken back maybe to that graph where I told you that in Alberta they had like 1,273 degree days. And in the graph that Paige did, you know, we saw that 1,100 to 1,200 degree days is kind of normal for that area. So if you're like, they get 50% more degree days than the need for a 1-year life cycle, how come we don't see a lot more of them entering the winter as 10-year-old adults, which aren't as cold hardy as Laden star larvae? And we don't know the threshold necessarily, but I bet you it's going to be minus 20 or something, so they're going to die up here in the winter. They can survive here, probably not here in the winter. And this, I think, is probably related to the pupation threshold. So Barb Bentz at USDA has done some work on this. And she thinks that there's probably a pupation threshold 15 to 18 degrees, and so that's what's stopping them from going too far in some areas. And although we're kind of wrapping up this development work, it is one thing I'd like to try and test experimentally. She also thinks the pupation threshold would probably vary by population geographically. So it's something we hope to do. We have time, work it in there. So I'm going to have to leave the development and temperature data. Yeah, we obviously have some more work to do on that. And I'll just go over some of the attack characteristics and productivity that we found. So this shows the mean attack density. This happens to be from this past year, 2013. What? Oh, apparently I'm psychic, sorry. The psychic scientist. All right, no, sorry, it should be 2012. It was late. So these are trees attacked last summer. They're out there right now overwintering. And you might kind of think that attack density here is lower in Alberta. It was high at this Grande Prairie site, and that's likely because they're running out of host there. We won't have that site for another year because there's no pine left. So it was definitely on the downhill side, that site. But if you jump here and say, oh, there's a lower attack density, it's still quite above the 60 attacks per meter squared that Berryman thought was a good trade-off between interspecific competition and overcoming tree defenses. But we know this varies greatly by year. The other thing I want to caution on, so you know, you might think it takes less beetles to kill a tree. It might take lower attack density, but sorry, I had a circle on this graph, just circling these two columns. We actually looked at attack density at our Musreau Lake site from 2007 to 2009 every year, and we saw it go from 55 attacks per meter squared up to 95 and then down to 69. And you see correspondingly the length of the attack zone on the bull, so the height of the bull that was attacked varied inversely with that. So although you had a much higher attack density here, I don't necessarily know that you had more beetles actually on that tree. Probably had the same amount of beetles, just in less space. So what we really need to do is make sure we do attack heights probably when we're doing these attack densities, and I know there's some issues with estimating attack height. It can be a bit a lot of guesswork. So the other graph here for the same site had attack densities from last year at about 70 for this site. So we're right in there. Dan was saying that after the in-flight in 2006 in Grande Prairie, you had population decreases in 07 and 08. And this actually shows that in 07, we don't have it here, it did decrease, and 44% decrease in 2008 from what we had expected. And then in 2009, when you had the next immigration event, we had a 420% increase from what we projected, and that was actually based on number of attacked trees and live insects under the bark. All right, so how are these beetles doing? This is trap numbers. They're doing really good. Fort St. John, they're doing really good. I have the emergence density here for females. So the number of females emerging per meter squared. And 2011 in Fort St. John, you can see these are huge numbers. So even if you have really high attack densities, even if you had 100 females attacking per meter squared, you can see you have huge growth rates here at those sites. Grande Prairie, from one year to the next, it did drop, and that's because, like I mentioned, that site crashed because it ran out of pine. We still have some healthy numbers here. I would like to point out Musreau Lake, which was doing well, and about this site's about 10 kilometers further south. Teddy Lane's about 10 kilometers closer to Grande Prairie than Musreau, very close. We had huge production, much lower population, but good production in the trees this year. The first year. The second year, the population crashed. And I couldn't believe this when I was out there in June sampling, because I'd just seen all these beetles at Musreau Lake and Highway 40. We go to Teddy Lane, and I can't find one alive, and usually I can find one alive. They never all die. But I had a really tough time, and when I looked at the temperatures under the bark, Teddy Lane, although it was so close to Musreau, got down to minus 43 under the bark. Highway 40, we had some mortality was really patchy within a tree and even between trees. And we actually saw higher survival on the south side, which I think was due to advanced development on that side. Better survival in the winter, and it got down to minus 38 about under the bark there. And then Musreau, where we had great survival, it was only got down to about minus 33. So over in Fox Creek, their emergence numbers were much more modest. So size of beetles, they're not lacking any. We know in the U.S. from Barb's work that there's a trade-off with development time and size in northern populations compared to southern populations in the U.S. I wouldn't expect that same relationship here, because we know that they don't have less degree days in Alberta necessarily for that. We have the first year of the data for this too, but I don't have it on this map, on this graph, because they actually got bigger in the second year, but I didn't want people to freak out about that. Although it was statistically significant, the biological amount was so small that it's not that much. So a lot of things affects the production and the size in terms of like phloem thickness, tree diameter. We know these relationships really well from the literature. We looked at that in this study too. We didn't necessarily find a relationship at all, but we were looking at just large, successfully mass-attacked trees. We were looking at the cream of the crop, so these emergence numbers too, they're only from successfully mass-attacked trees. So if you have 100 attacked trees in your stand, you can't just multiply them by these numbers. You know, maybe only 50 of those are really good attacks. Some of them are resisted, some of them are strip attacks. This is for successful mass-attacked trees. So we were already looking at just kind of the bigger size trees, so we didn't find a relationship with phloem thickness, bark thickness at all. Length of female gallery, they made longer galleries in Alberta, probably because they attacked earlier, so they had longer to go there in the summer. So if you take this data with the lower attack density data as well, what this would mean, because we also have the total cumulative length of female galleries in the sample as well. So by however many females, just how much gallery do you have, because they lay about the same number of eggs per centimeter of gallery, and it didn't vary across sites. So an interpretation of this with the attack density data would be that in Alberta, each individual female is potentially making a larger contribution to the population. All right, so I mentioned we're going to finish the development work, and next we're going to do cold tolerance, winter survival. Not just lower lethal thresholds, but acclimation requirements in the fall, severity and duration of exposure, and then probably we'd love to get at some of that spring mortality that you can get after a warming event. They lose their cold hardiness, and then there's a snap. We do know that cold accumulation obviously varies. East and west of the divide, this is cold accumulation below minus 20, even between years. So even if you don't get the lower lethal temperatures, what is the mortality associated with a lot of time at minus 30? So for example, in this winter here, you had a lot of time down at minus 30. Last winter was really mild. You only had that one cold snap in January. So even though you didn't hit the lethal lower threshold here, was there more cumulative mortality from this type of temperature profile? So this is Teddy Lane. This is the site where last year I said you hit about minus 40, minus 43 under the bark, and it did cause mortality. And when I saw this in June, I got pretty excited, and I emailed Dan and asked him what their R values were coming back as, because even though your winter was really mild last year, you were so close in some areas to having a cold snap to knocking them back good. So So there's a lot of folks to acknowledge. We have a lot of volunteers in the field, have a lot of co-op students, lots of measurements and sample processing time in the lab. They also contribute to the field work a lot. And of course, as Keith mentioned, you can't do the research without the appropriate funding.